So you can't take emotion out of decision making, and instead you have to recognize the role of emotion and integrate that into the training that you do.
Thought that came to me that I think is very important and very misunderstood, and it's a real problem for soldiers because I've lived through it myself, and I've worked with many soldiers in my career that have PTSD and all sorts of problems, so I'm very familiar with how this goes. And that is this: not only the military, but business, our whole business mindset in the West, and a lot of other influences have programmed people to believe that to be successful in operations like the military and in business, you have to completely squelch your emotions, and they harbor on it has to be rational. You can't become emotional or irrational. So that's a very dangerous concept, and one that I've seen be very problematic in military families. I used to know several military policemen, and they spend a lot of time with violence in families, alcohol abuse, drug abuse in the military, which is a lot more rampant than most people realize. What's your words of advice on how to use your emotions as effective guides, not just squelching them, so that you have a balance between the rational and the unrational? Because emotions give us a huge amount of useful information if you know how to engage them intelligently. But I think a lot of the problem we have, especially with young men trying to be superheroes, is that they get so brainwashed into the rational that they don't know how to engage the feminine aspects of themselves or the unrational emotional components of themselves. So do you have any tips for filtering emotions and knowing how to use them effectively?
Yeah, I mean, like a quick side thing, I think the idea that emotions are a dichotomous feminine thing is inaccurate. Like emotions are a universal, regardless of sex or gender or whatever. And then further, like more importantly, rational decision making has to involve emotion. If you are not using emotion, you're probably going to make terrible decisions, and you're going to spend a lot of time fixating on minutia that doesn't matter, because emotions are like an effective way to guide rapid decision making, especially under stress. And you can develop what those emotions are and the directions in which they pull you. But if you're making decisions as if your emotions or the emotions of the people in your life don't matter, then you're not making a rational decision. That's like saying, like, I'm going to drive my car as fast as I can or as far as I can, but the gas gauge doesn't matter. Like it's part of the process. It's part of the world that you're operating in. If you look at, say, Antonio Damasio's work, he's got several books on this. He's done a ton of really good research on the role of emotion in decision making. And you have to be able to recognize and understand the role that your emotions play when you think or when you decide things. Like you've probably met people, say, with like autism spectrum disorder, who do have emotional regulation issues, who have a difficult time integrating emotion into their decision making, and they do absolutely bizarre things because like they might spend an hour and a half trying to decide which pair of shoes to put on or whatever. They have a hard time parsing out what information is valid and should be fixated on and what information should be excluded. Um, there are a lot of other studies on, say, the Iowa gambling task is one of them, where when we're recognizing a pattern, in this case, they're giving people a gambling task where they're flipping cards or they're choosing cards of some sort, and there are multiple decks to choose from, and they're either rewarded or punished based on the random choice that they make or based on the choice that they make. And in these tests, like one or two of the decks will be weighted to punish them excessively. So if you choose this deck, you're gambling. You might win a dollar, lose a dollar. One of these decks is going to be weighted so that you're going to lose almost all of the time when you choose it. And they'll find that when people take these tests, they will emotionally respond to the bad deck before they're able to cognitively rationalize, before they're able to express what it is that they think. They don't know what it is that they're picking up on, but some part of their brain has detected a pattern that this thing over here is dangerous and harmful, and over here is safer. I don't know why, but I'm going to avoid this bad thing. And they'll have the emotional response. It's a measurable change in their autonomic system before they have a rational thought, before they have a cognitive thought that they can point to. And rationality, in most cases, or in many cases, is just a tool for the rationalization, or intellect is a tool for the rationalization of impulse. Like we can see this in split brain studies where people have their corpus callosum, the thing that divides the two hemispheres of your brain, severed. That can be a thing in, say, epilepsy treatment, I believe. I can't think of all the reasons why
Yeah,
people do that.
epilepsy is a common one.
And they'll do these studies on these people where the two hemispheres of the brain no longer directly communicate, where they'll block, because our vision comes in through one eye to one side of the brain and the other eye to the opposite. They'll do a thing where they'll give someone an instruction like, go outside of the room and go get a can of Coke. And the person, they'll receive this information into the, like, so to speak, like non-rational side of their brain, the right side of their brain. So it's coming in through their left eye, I think is how they structure this. The person will get up, get out of their chair, and go and walk to go do the thing that they've just been told to do. And then while they're doing it, that they'll get interrupted by the researchers, and they'll say, what are you doing? What are you up to right now? And they'll be like, oh, I was thirsty. They'll generate a reason to justify the behavior. They were given an explicit instruction, but they're not consciously aware that they were given an instruction. They're just following an impulse, but they immediately generate a reason, a rational reason for doing that thing, for the impulse that they're following. So it's a way of illustrating that what we often think of as rational behavior, it's just making up a story that feels good, that feels like it makes sense, but in reality, we're just rationalizing an impulse that we had. So you can't take emotion out of decision making, and instead you have to recognize the role of emotion and integrate that into the training that you do. One of the terms for that, for sort of that world, is a secondary emotion, which is the emotion that we feel in response to another emotion. So maybe you feel fear for a second. Like maybe you look at the stock market and it's just dropped a lot and you feel fear about your, financial state. Like maybe you're not going to be able to pay your mortgage next month, or your retirement's just been compromised or whatever. You feel fear, and then in response to fear, you feel anger. And now you start acting angry or whatever. You might see this in a physical training scenario where someone feels fatigued, and in response to fatigue, maybe they respond with anger, or they respond with sadness, or they respond with whatever. But a secondary emotion is the emotion that we have in response to another thing. And it's usually the second emotion that causes problems. If we look at, say, survival scenarios, like people are in plane crashes, they're lost at sea, whatever, the secondary emotion that people have is often what chases them or drives them to do something stupid. And we can develop that emotion through training. We can develop the emotional response that we have through training. Like, say, your example earlier of training for your triathlon when it's super rainy and shitty and cold outside. That's going to cause a primary emotion, which is maybe some kind of dread and anticipation of being physically uncomfortable. And then you're going to have a secondary emotion, and that could be motivation, that could be steeling your resolve to go do the hard thing anyway, or it could be a desire for comfort. And you can change what that emotion is going to be through training, because your emotions eventually reflect the things that you did and felt in the past. We use a thing called self-hurting, where when we make a rapid decision, we base that decision off of previous experiences in somewhat similar conditions. Even if those specific conditions have changed, we'll still base the decision we make now off of the decisions we've made in the past. So the way that we train shapes the emotional impulses that we have in the future. So when we're training, we're shaping the emotions we have. The emotions that we have are going to change the impulses that we have, the things that we do when we're under stress and we're thinking rapidly and we're making decisions that aren't really cognitive. Like special ops selection, say BUDS or special forces selection, whatever, the majority of the attrition is from people quitting. They just hit a low point. They have the shittiest, one of the shittiest days of their life. They're cold, they're wet, they're tired, they're hungry, they're being yelled at, and they quit. They just give up. And a lot of times that quitting, it doesn't just happen in the shittiest moments. Sometimes it happens on Monday morning or Sunday night or at lunch in between terrible events when they have a moment to think about it. But sometimes when it does happen in those shitty moments, it's an impulse. When you're under a lot of stress, you don't have a lot of access to the cognitive part of your brain, like to your executive function. Your frontal cortex kind of goes offline when you're under extreme stress. What you're left with is impulses or emotions. And so someone's susceptibility to quitting under stress or doing any other thing that they would probably prefer they don't do most of the time, like everyone has a thing where they say like, I don't know what I was thinking. It just seemed like the thing to do at the time. It was an impulse. I just acted on it. And it's usually when they do something regrettable that is driven by a secondary emotion that you have under stress. And you can shape that emotion. You can shape the impulses that you have that are going to affect your decision making when you're really tired. But you don't get there, to wrap back around your point, you don't get there by ignoring emotion or pretending that you can think without emotion. Um, you need the ability to recognize and regulate your emotions, but you can't remove them from decision making without actually becoming really irrational or ineffective at making decisions, and also just hurting the people around you.
Well, I was going to say it's very dangerous in leadership positions. One of the things I want to clarify is a lot of men and soldiers in particular have a negative reflex to any mention of feminine connection to the emotions. But in the
Mm.
science of consciousness, the feeling nature and one's internal experience of themselves is classified as feminine, and the thinking nature and outward projected consciousness is classified as masculine. So when I mentioned the feminine elements, that's what I'm referring to,
Hmm.
as opposed to the standard thought of
The like,
emotion as
yeah, that makes sense.